Most people don't wake up one day and just decide to live a life that they dislike. That's not how it happens. What happens is much quieter, almost reasonable. A job they didn't love but didn't hate. A relationship that wasn't wrong, just uninspiring. A city that felt convenient. A version of themselves that felt acceptable. Nothing felt urgent enough to reject, so they stayed. At first, it feels responsible, even mature. You're not chasing fantasies, you're being practical. You're grateful, you're patient, you're not being dramatic. And for a while, that restraint is praised. But slowly, something shifts. Not in a way that you can point to, not in a way that makes a good story, just in the background. What people rarely talk about is how much of life is decided by momentum, not intention. You don't actively choose most things, you default into them. One decision creates a constraint, that constraint creates another decision, and eventually the path narrows. Not because you're trapped, but because changing now would require admitting that the earlier choices weren't neutral after all. And that's uncomfortable. So instead of asking, is this what I want? People ask, can I tolerate this? That question quietly replaces the first. There's also a social element to it. Once your life looks stable on the outside, it becomes harder to question it on the inside. People compliment you, people say that you're lucky. They say that you made it. And suddenly, dissatisfaction feels ungrateful. So you learn to speak about life in a way that makes sense to other people, even if it doesn't make sense to you. You explain it, you rationalize it, downplay the parts that feel off. Over time, you stop mentioning them altogether. What makes this especially difficult is that nothing is wrong enough to leave. There's no crisis, no betrayal, no dramatic failure. Just a low-grade comfort that never quite goes away. And because there's no obvious problem, there's no obvious permission to leave. People imagine that unhappiness announces itself loudly, but more often it whispers. It shows up as boredom that you can't shake, as resentment towards people who took risks, as a strange defensiveness when someone talks about wanting more. Eventually, many people adapt. They don't love their lives, but they learn to live inside them. They develop routines, they develop distractions, build identities that make the situation seem intentional. Things like, this is just how life is. You can't have everything. At least I'm stable. And maybe those statements are true, but they're also protective. They protect you from having to admit that something essential was deferred, not because it was impossible, but because it felt inconvenient at the time. The most unsettling part is this. From the outside, most often these lives look completely fine. Nothing appears broken, which is why they're rarely questioned. But from the inside, there is often a quiet sense that something didn't get chosen. It just happened. And that realization usually comes late. Not early, not when change is easy, but after years of saying, this is good enough. This isn't about regret. It's about recognition. About noticing how often reasonable becomes a substitute for honest. How often stability becomes a reason to stop listening to yourself. How often people confuse endurance with fulfillment. Most people don't live lives they hate. They live lives that they never fully agreed to. And once you see that pattern, it's hard to unsee it.